importantly, beginning with his early work in 1999 in the state of Kerala. And as discussant today, we have Dr. Thomas Isaac, economist and a former Minister of Finance in the Kerala Ministry. And we look forward to a very engaging discussion. We welcome comments and feedback on the chat box. The speaker shall have about 40 to 50 minutes to present, as well as 25 to 30 minutes for our discussion. We apologize for the delay caused. And over to you, Professor Heller.
Thank you very much, Professor Kannan. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
And many thanks to Mahmoud Korea, who initially contacted me and told me about the iShore initiative, which is extremely exciting. And very many thanks to Dr. Hakkim for the introductions. As Professor Kannan pointed out, my book on Kerala came out in 1999. So it's a bit old, and I'm getting a bit old, and it's been quite a bit of time that I've spent any extended amount of time in Kerala. But fortunately, over the past year, given COVID and given the pandemic situation, many events like this have been able to happen internationally on Zoom and other platforms. And when Thomas Isaac was finance minister, he worked on a 5-year budget plan, and as part of that process, initiated a series of conversations that I was very fortunate to be part of. So I find myself 20 years removed and yet drawn back into very exciting conversations about the so-called Kerala model, the future of Kerala's democracy, and the really quite extraordinary efforts to collectively deliberate about the direction in which the Kerala economy might develop. So I'm going to comment a bit on some of those debates today, but I'm going to do so first by making some general comments on the so-called Kerala model, and then talk a little bit about the relationship between the Kerala model and the future information economy, and then finish with some comments about the liberal arts, the humanities, and the social sciences, and what role they might play going forward in supporting this initiative to promote an information economy. So there's really, I want to begin with this term, the Kerala model. It's been around for maybe 30 years now, and it's invariably part of any conversation about Kerala. People immediately refer to the, quote, Kerala model. And of course, the distinguishing features of the Kerala model have been its success as a subnational state in promoting what we call social development. And everyone's familiar with the basic terms of the Kerala model, so I'm not going to review all of the literature and the key indicators. But by any comparative metric, Kerala has performed extremely well in terms of promoting social development. The reason I don't like the idea of a model is it implies something that can be transplanted. It implies something that's been self-consciously constructed. We make models. And once that the model has been constructed, it can be exported. It can be transplanted to a different context. And while I certainly think there are many elements of the Kerala model that are replicable and should be replicated, I don't think it's this one thing that can just be transplanted. And I also think calling it a model distracts from a deeper and a more historical understanding of how Kerala got to where it is today. The Kerala model is a product of history. It's a product of a long repeated cycles of social and political mobilization. It's the product of a lot of conflict. Most of that conflict having taken place within the framework of an electoral democracy, so with minimal violence and disruption, but nonetheless a lot of class conflict around social issues. And at the end of the day, what's called the model in my mind, is more of a socio-political compact. It's a socio-political compact that's been developed, deliberated, and negotiated through a democratic process. But as is true of any compact, it's only so good as how well it can adapt to new circumstances. And obviously the new circumstances today are the circumstances of a very different global economy, an economy based less on industry and manufacturing and increasingly on services and information, and completely new economies and new ways of generating growth. And so the model, what I call a socioeconomic compact, will have to evolve if it is to successfully harness its capabilities and leverage those in making the most of the opportunities that come with this new information economy. So let me very briefly, before I get into more substance, make one very large theoretical point. And this is a theoretical point about democracy. There's a huge literature, a huge debate. How do we define democracy? Most of that debate's been dominated by political scientists. But in the tradition, in the political theory tradition, there are really two different and quite paradoxical positions that have evolved in the debate on democracy. The first is what's simply known as the liberal tradition, associated with mainstream political science. And it is the idea that democracy is essentially about individual rights guaranteed by constitutions, that allow for individuals to freely participate in the civic and political life of a society, and of course, allow them to vote. And that the real defining element of democracy is the election. This is Schumpeter, this is Robert Dahl, classic political theory. And the emphasis is really on procedure, on what we call formalism, the formalism of basic civic and political rights, and the procedure of the election. And the election then becomes a process of simply aggregating those individual interests. Everyone gets to vote for the party or the candidates that they prefer. And at the end of the day, through a majoritarian or a PR or some other aggregation system, we select our representatives. And at that point, we delegate the affairs of the public to elected representatives, right? And no one disagrees with this fundamental definition. This is how we think of democracy. This is how the academic literature has measured democracy, et cetera. But it stands in tension with another tradition, with the classic democratic tradition that goes back to a classic Greek theories of democracy. And this is the theory, or the Republican theory, associated with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Republican theory of democracy as the expression of people's power, of the sovereignty of the people. That democracy is less about individual rights and the rule of law and the aggregating function of elections, and it's much more about the expression of popular will and the empowerment of the people, right? So less emphasis on representatives now, and much more emphasis on direct participation, and much more emphasis on deliberation in the sense of forging a common will, as opposed to individuals simply pursuing their self-interest through the political process and by voting, right? So now there's an effort to construct the common will. Liberal theorists are very nervous, very suspicious of any project of constructing the common will, because they fear that any such project could undermine individual liberties. Republican theorists, on the other hand, worry that the emphasis on individual rights and proceduralism comes at the expense of the genuine expression of people's power. All right, so I just want to make that general point, because I do think this is a fundamental tension in any democracy. And yet it is a tension that I want to argue, by and large, has been, I don't want to say the word resolved is too strong, because that tension is always present, but it's a tension that's been quite successfully managed in the Kerala context, much more so than at the national level, and much more so, I would argue, than many of the traditional celebrated liberal democracies like the United States or Switzerland. The second point I want to make is to read you a quote. And this is a quote from the political theorist Gurpreet Mahajan, who's a political scientist at JNU. And I hate doing this, especially in a Zoom context, but it's a really important quote because I think it goes to the heart of this paradox that I just identified between the liberal and the Republican tradition. Gurpreet Mahajan writes the following: "No society is free of differences. Differences of wealth, status, interest, functions, talents, and opinion exist in every society." So modern societies are incredibly diverse, complex, multicultural, different interests, functions, identities, etc. Well established, especially true in the Indian context, especially true in the context of Kerala with its multiple religious and caste and other identities. Then she goes on, "The particularity of democracy is that it does not privilege any one kind of difference. Rather, it distinguishes between two sorts of differences, those that are sources of inequality in society and those that protect and nourish creativity. The former, in its view, are to be overcome, that is, the differences in inequality are to be overcome, while the latter, the differences in individuality and creativity, are to be nourished and celebrated." This is what she says. The former, inequality, is to be overcome, while the latter, creativity and individuality, are to be nurtured and celebrated. It is this twin conception of difference that equality and freedom find a place in democratic theory. So she is in effect arguing for resolving the tension between the liberal tradition, which protects and nurtures individual rights and creativity, and the Republican tradition that allows for the empowerment of the people and efforts to reduce inequality in society. But there's always this tension, right, which is incredibly difficult to manage. I want to suggest that the way one manages that tension in real democracies and so-called actually existing democracies is by balancing the power of political society, the state and political parties and representative institutions and the rule of law, with the power of civil society, which is the realm of autonomy, creativity, individuality, but also group identities. And when you can balance these two, you can resolve some of the tensions between the liberal and the Republican traditions of democracy. Now, the title of my talk was Decentering Knowledge. And let me explain in which way I want to try to decenter knowledge. I want to do it in two ways. First, I want to suggest that the case of Kerala flies in the face and contradicts almost every accepted argument about the conditions under which democracy flourishes most successfully. And I want to decenter it by suggesting that as one develops a better understanding of the specificity of Indian and Kerala's democracy, one has to really rethink the democratic theoretical tradition that's been developed mostly in the West, and that most of the time is being exported to the rest of the world. So we want to provincialize that knowledge. I also want to try to work with you and dialogue to decenter Kerala's own self-understanding of Kerala's democracy by putting it in a somewhat more comparative perspective. So let me quickly summarize again what the Kerala model as a, quote, democracy actually means. There's been a dramatic expansion of the welfare state. There's been an expansion of opportunity for all social groups, irrespective of their backgrounds. And of course, not all social groups have achieved equality of opportunity in Kerala, but certainly there's been a broad-based equalization of opportunities. There's been, a la Amartya Sen, an investment in basic individual capabilities, health and education, access to public spaces. That said, there are still tremendous gender inequities between some caste and religious groups, some outlier communities, the fishermen community, Adivasi communities, et cetera. But in general, by any comparative standard, there's been a general expansion of basic opportunities and a certain equalization of outcomes. I would argue KP Kannan gave a talk in a series that was hosted by Gift a few weeks back, where he had some data on employment figures in Kerala. And we know there's high levels of unemployment. We know that there's a high level of unemployment of the highly educated, but the gender differences are really, really dramatic. And I would suggest, one of the areas where there's still much progress to be made. But that aside, what makes, in my mind, the story of Kerala's democracy different than conventional definitions? And here, let me point out the main arguments in the democracy literature. Maybe the most famous or influential argument, and this has come from neoliberal economists and Marxist economists alike, that the precondition for democracy is wealth. You need a certain level of material well-being in order to allow democracy to flourish. And the argument, going back to Marx, going back to Ricardo, is that if democracy comes before capitalism is well developed, popular power, and in particular the power of subordinate classes to mobilize and to demand redistribution, could undermine the dynamism of capitalism, which is predicated on private property and accumulation, et cetera. So that's been a very dominant argument. A second argument comes from de Tocqueville. And de Tocqueville argued famously in his book on America that in order to have democracy, you have to have basic equality to begin with, basic equality of property and associational life. And then you can cultivate the type of citizen who can actively participate in democracy and make democracy successful. Associated arguments include having a robust middle class. A famous argument from Huntington that first you build the institutions and then you allow for mobilization. And then recently, a lot of literature claiming that democracy flourishes best in relatively homogeneous societies, that the real danger to democracy is difference, is heterogeneity, is having a multicultural society. And a lot of right-wing defenders of democracy, of course, associate the well-being of democracy with having an essentialized identity. Trumpism, the various anti-immigrant right-wing movements in Europe, and of course the BJP's Hindutva project, right? That democracy will work best if and only if India is in fact a quote Hindu nation. Kerala flies in the face of every one of these arguments. If we take as a matter, a propositional matter, that Kerala has been a successful democracy, and I argue it has been, we have to recognize that it was built against the context of a capitalist economy that was only beginning to develop, and where demands for redistribution, the demands for land reform, et cetera, did represent a threat to dominant interests. We have to recognize that democracy or democratization processes were not led by the middle class or citizens who enjoyed a lot of equality amongst themselves. It was led by subordinate groups demanding greater inequality. It very clearly was driven by mobilization. Huntington argued that if you have too much mobilization, it will undermine the institutions. It will overwhelm the institutions by creating too much demand. So you first have to build those institutions, liberal constitutional institutions, and only then open up democracy to the masses, to mobilization, et cetera. Kerala has flipped that around. And I would even argue that it's popular mobilization that built the strong institutions. It was the demand for rights, it was the demand for recognition, it was the demand for equity that has really driven the institutionalization of the judiciary, of the state apparatuses, drove the process of decentralization. So it's mobilization that has led to institutionalization. So in every respect, the case of Kerala, and there are parallels in the developing world, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Mauritius, to some degree now Brazil as well, although Brazil is undergoing a bit of a reversal with Bolsonaro. But these are all cases of economies that were colonial economies that were incredibly dependent, that had poorly developed capitalist economies. At that early stage, though, had broad-based mobilization. That mobilization drove the democratization process, and all of the countries that I mentioned, Costa Rica, Uruguay, to some degree Chile as well, Brazil and Kerala, have, despite neoliberalism, despite globalization, despite building democracy against the backdrop of tremendous diversity and inequality, have nonetheless been able to build relatively stable and relatively inclusive democratic systems. And as we look more closely at the specific case of Kerala, I think there's a case to be made that this is an example of what I would call an embedded democracy. And very broadly by embedded, I mean, as Karl Polanyi meant when he argued that markets must be embedded in society, I am arguing that the state, the democratic state, including political parties and representative institutions, have to be linked to society, not just through elections, but much as in the Republican participatory tradition, they have to be continuously linked to society through a kind of embeddedness. And this embeddedness, which allows for day-to-day democratic practices, for continuous accountability, not just accountability every 4 years when there's election. This embeddedness has a number of elements. And it begins, of course, with elections, and it should be said, it is, when I first came to Kerala, when I first met Thomas Isaac, when I was first learning as a graduate student about Kerala, the literature I had read simply always emphasized that Kerala was a, quote, problem state. Lots of political party competition, quite strenuous competition, lots of changes in government, even some governments being removed by the central government, a lot of turmoil, a lot of mobilization, a lot of strikes. And many analysts pointed to Kerala as a problem of democratization. It turns out, of course, that it's been an incredibly stable political system. The LDF, UDF division is a fairly programmatic division. It's a fairly stable division. And it's a division that even as governments have replaced each other, and of course the last election is the first time in quite some time that a government has succeeded itself, but even when there was succession and change in government, there was still a certain continuity in basic policies, right? Inevitably some reversals, but the general trajectory has always advanced irrespective of the UDF or the LDF being in power. And I know many are thinking to themselves right now, yes, but it's the left parties that are driving this. And that might well be true, but they're driving it whether they're in government or outside of government. And I would argue because of the fundamental embeddedness of the system. So it begins with elections. It's also about the public sphere, and there's been a lot of theorizing about the centrality of the public sphere to any modern democracy, but it's obviously in the public sphere that issues, debates, identities, fundamental questions about values, aspirations get processed, get problematized, get debated. And this is the media, this is forums like this one, it's the universities, it's the unions, the associations, the women's groups, the various NGOs. And this is a constant churning of ideas and communicative practices. And I would argue, and others have researched this, Robin Jeffrey wrote a famous book about this, but by any metric, to the extent that there are hard measurable metrics of the vitality of the public sphere, Kerala has an extraordinarily vital and vibrant public sphere, as measured by the number of media publications, and whether this is the traditional press or new forms of social media and TV media, it's incredibly dynamic and vibrant. The third element of embeddedness is what I call expanding the surface area of the state. You know, one of the complaints about democratic states or any states in much of the developing world is that for the ordinary citizen, it's often very difficult to find the state. The judiciary is very difficult to engage with, and local government sometimes is completely absent or so weak that it can do very little for the ordinary citizen. And the ordinary citizen really struggles to, quote, find the state. A decade ago, I did a lot of field work in New Delhi, the capital city, the wealthiest city in India. We did a lot of field work in JJCs and various so-called slums. And one of the things that we found absolutely striking was that the average citizen rarely encounters the state. And when they do, it's usually the police. And most of their mediations with the state take place through intermediaries, through brokers, through pradhans, through non-officials, non-elected officials, right? They rarely engage the state as bearers of formal rights. They engage the state much more often as clients or as supplicants. One of the dramatic differences between Kerala and other states, and I'm not saying anything here most of you don't know, but I think the point needs to be emphasized, is that because of decentralization, the People's Campaign, and whatever one might think about how participatory local government has actually become in Kerala, whatever concerns one might have about demobilization and that maybe local government isn't as participatory as it was designed to be or as it was in the initial stages of the campaign, the simple fact remains that because of the campaign, local states, panchayats and municipalities today are much more robust and substantial institutions than they used to be. So simple things like getting a birth certificate or getting a child into an educational institution or accessing primary health care, as we've seen and continue to see during the COVID pandemic, all of this has become much easier for the average citizen to be able to access the state, find the state, get resources from the state. We've done, with a large team of researchers in India, we've been conducting surveys in 15 different Indian cities, including Kochi. And by far and away, Kochi is the city where the largest percentage of citizens say they can depend on their local councillor to get access to resources, irrespective of their political party affiliation, right? That the linchpin of the relationship between the local citizen and the city of Kochi is their local councillor, and to a degree that we just don't find in any other Indian cities. So this is an example for me of embedding the state, right? That embeddedness has been driven by and has in turn reinforced the rights of citizens, right? So the state has become embedded because of a demand side logic of movements demanding their rights, demanding public services, demanding public action. But by the same token, by strengthening local government, strengthening the access of day-to-day citizens to their civic rights and to their social rights, it's reinforced citizenship and the general culture of rights, which is really the quintessential expression of a democratized society. So that's the general comment I wanted to make about embeddedness of Kerala's democracy. I now want to try to end my talk by talking about the new economy and by linking it to new theories of growth that some of the economists in this forum might be familiar with, and then saying something about the role of the social sciences and the humanities, which I know is your main area of interest. So we're in a completely new economy, right? We used to theorize capitalism as the accumulation of things, of assets, of property, of capital, capitalism, accumulating capital. And all the economic models were about capital mobilization, accumulation of assets. And of course, the industrial economy of the 20th century more or less was about accumulating real, tangible, sunken assets and generating value from those assets, mobilizing labor, et cetera. New growth theory, and I won't go too deeply into it, but basically new growth theory argues that real growth and real dynamism in particular, increases in productivity and innovation, come not from assets, but from ideas. That the key form of capital today is not physical capital, but human capital, right? And already economists have done a lot of work showing the relationship between the accumulation of human capital, the East Asian developmental state model, for example, and successful economic growth, right? But that then begs the question, what role can the state play in creating an environment, a setting, a culture that allows for ideas to emerge, and for creativity and for innovation in the actual process of bringing ideas to the market. And I want to argue the kind of state that does that is what Peter Evans is a sociologist who is much involved with the first round of theories on the developmental state. This is the 1980s, trying to explain the success of East Asia and arguing that the developmental state, which helped promote and accelerate industrialization, was really the key to East Asia's economic success. Peter Evans and others now have been retooling that argument to make an argument about what they call the 21st century developmental state. For them, the 21st century developmental state is a state that invests, per Amartya Sen, in human capabilities. That the real role of the state is not so much accumulation anymore or promoting industry. The real role of the state is to invest in human capabilities, to invest in education, in health, in the care economy, to invest ultimately in the creative capacity of human beings. And what this requires, of course, is a state that is deeply embedded in civil society, that has many points of contact with students, with nurses, with frontline workers, with association, with Kudumbashri, with the many different expressions of creativity in society, and to interact with them in order to co-produce ideas, to co-produce creativity, to coordinate across sectors, to coordinate across interests, and to create a culture, a general culture of deliberation, cooperation, and creativity. In other words, there's a perfect alignment, in my view, between the embedded nature of Kerala's economy and the needs of the 21st century developmental state, which is what finally brings me to the humanities and to the social sciences. And here I want to make two different kinds of argument. One, I want to make an economic argument for why investing in the social sciences and the humanities is key to supporting the information economy. But I also want to make a larger political argument that there's a real danger of dystopia in the new information economy, and that the only way really to protect ourselves against the dystopian tendencies of the new information economy is by ensuring that this economy is embedded in the humanities and is embedded in the social sciences. So let me make the economic argument first. And I want to start with a story about Steve Jobs. And I'm not necessarily a huge Steve Jobs fan per se, but there's no doubt that Steve Jobs was the quintessential entrepreneur of the new information economy. And Steve Jobs was not particularly good at coding. He wasn't particularly good in computer sciences. There were others who ultimately did that. What Steve Jobs was really good at was design. Steve Jobs understood design. And for all of us who've become, completely dependent on Apple products, part of that dependency is rooted in the attractiveness of the design of Apple products beyond the technology. And in a famous biography of Steve Jobs, he was quoted as saying he never finished college, but he did go to Reed College, which is the quintessential liberal arts college. And before he went off and started working with others in his famous garage and developing Apple products, he said that the only useful class he ever took at Reed College was calligraphy. Now think about that, calligraphy. It's in a modern economy where everything is online and keyboards, et cetera, one really has to wonder what the role of calligraphy might be. And yet it sensitized him to the importance of design, right? And of course, one of the first things that Apple innovated with was fonts, right? Simple, being able to choose different kinds of fonts. So it's that sort of creativity that really drove this, at least the creation of Apple as one of the great innovators of the 21st century. A second point is a point about clusters. There's a huge literature in economics and sociology about clusters. It turns out whether it's the industrial economy, whether it's the craft-based economies of medieval Europe, or whether it's about the information economy of the 21st century, for all the talk of virtuality, for all the talk of remote work, et cetera, it turns out that physical proximity is the key to innovation. is absolutely critical to innovation. So one thinks about Silicon Valley, one thinks about the Boston area, one thinks about Emilia-Romagna in northern Italy, the Tirupur cluster in Tamil Nadu in the textile industry. Dynamic, innovative industries require a clustering of people, right? And a density of interactions. And in the past, it was quite geographical and often located around historical centers of trade, et cetera. In the modern economy, it turns out that the clusters are always co-located with universities. That the great clustering device of the modern economy is the university. So Silicon Valley famously is bordered by UC Berkeley and Stanford, right? The Boston area with all its software and biotech firms is bordered by Harvard and MIT. The Northern Triangle in North Carolina, again, two great universities, Duke and North Carolina. So this begs the question, why are universities so critical to these new economies of innovation and creativity? And a lot of people would point to the STEM sciences, right? It's all about having a lot of engineers, having a lot of mathematicians, having a lot of coders, et cetera. And certainly that's part of the story. But what's really interesting in the United States is that with the possible exception of MIT, all of these universities are liberal arts universities. And I want to use my own university, Brown, as an example of this. Brown is not Harvard or Berkeley per se, but it is one of the Ivies. And it's the Ivy that is best known for the open curriculum. Brown students, whether they're interested in engineering, biology, or the humanities, pretty much do whatever they want. There are no requirements. You spend 4 years, you take whatever classes you want. And famously, Brown students, regardless of their particular interests, tend to take a whole range of classes. And I can tell you that they get recruited by Silicon Valley, they get recruited by Google, they get recruited by, God forbid, Wall Street and financial corporations. They also get recruited by NGOs and publishers. Publishers love Brown. And I can tell you that the recruiters never pay any attention whatsoever to what degree the student actually got. Whether they got a BA in sociology or mathematics or computer sciences or South Asian languages, the recruiters just care that they came from Brown because they have learned how to learn. And they've learned how to learn in an interdisciplinary environment and with great creativity, right? And I would argue that in the information economy, the information economy is less about accumulating information than producing creative forms of information. And such creativity has to be rooted in history, in the humanities, and in our ethics, which brings me to my last point, the dystopian tendencies of the information economy. We've all spent a year interacting like this on Zoom. And on the one hand, there's much to celebrate. This event could have not transpired. Thomas Isaac couldn't be with us. We wouldn't have an audience from across the world without the possibilities of this Zoom-based forum. But at the same time, this is completely dystopian, right? We would all prefer to be in a seminar room, interacting one-on-one, having chai, taking breaks, being physically present, socializing. One of the things that I think has become really clear through the COVID crisis is that working remotely is possible. The question is it desirable? Do we really want to live in a world where you sit at home all day, engage with colleagues through Zoom, buy everything through Amazon and make billionaires even richer than they were before? Stop shopping. Most of my friends don't shop physically anymore. They shop entirely online. People have cocktail parties online now. People reconnect with friends not by visiting, but by having a Zoom engagement. To me, this is completely dystopian. And maybe this is my theoretical predilection as a sociologist, but ultimately we are social beings. And I think there's a real danger, even at my university now, there's a lot of talk about, going forward, how do we invest in hybrid teaching and remote teaching, et cetera? This is not an investment I personally want to make. I think this is completely dystopian. And it's dystopian socially. It's also dystopian from a political economy point of view. Shohana Zuboff has written an extraordinary book called Surveillance Capitalism. And surveillance capitalism essentially makes two fundamental points about the new nature of the information economy. First and foremost, it is about accumulating your information, accumulating and commodifying your information, right? Google and all these other media platforms basically suck up data, your locational data, your preference in movies, culture, music, food, socialization, dating, etc. They repackage it, they sell it to others who can then target you more successfully, right? To ultimately solve the old dilemma of the supply-demand curve. And this is the second point she makes. This industry is about the production of desire. This industry is now about mobilizing your private information to tell you what your desires really are, right? And it's difficult to think of anything more dystopian than this private accumulation and commodification of your identity and then reselling it back to you in the form of, here's your favorite reading list, here's your favorite music, this is the bar you should frequent, etc. Now, these are tendencies, and arguably there's counter tendencies. I want to argue that the most important counter tendency is that we always re-embed the economy, in this case, the information economy, in democratic society. And we embed it in particular in an ethics, in a deliberative democratic culture where we debate the use of these technologies, the nature of privacy, how information is accumulated, appropriate, bought and sold, that we embed these debates in a kind of liberal arts environment. And again, one of the central institutions, and not the only institution, but a critically important institution for embedding these debates, for opening up deliberations about the future of the information economy, is the university. But if it's a university that's entirely STEM driven, the debate will entirely be about productivity and efficiency, whereas the debate has to be about what's ethically right, what's creative, what is rooted and respectful of our histories, and what promotes inclusion and sustainability. So I'll stop there because more than anything, I'm really excited to hear from Thomas Isaac and to continue this conversation with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Heller, for delineating the aspects of Kerala society and economy. I'm going to hand over the mic to Dr. Thomas Isaac for his brief comments, followed by question answer session. We will start with Meenakshi Menon's question and then continue the discussion. Dr. Isaac?
Yes, thank you. Heller, I will start with a question to you. You started with Kerala. You ended in information technology and embedding in. How do you come back to Kerala? I didn't get that link totally. Can you respond?
Yeah, no. So look, this is all reflected in your 5-year budget plan, right? How does Kerala capitalize on its human capital investments? And it capitalizes on those human capital investments by creating platforms that will allow for a society with extraordinarily high levels of human capital to scale that human capital up and translate it into successful ventures in the new economy. Now, part of this is going to be market dynamics. But as we know, markets work best when they're embedded, when they're regulated, when they're underwritten by solid institutions and investments. And in the case of the information economy, the kind of clustering dynamics that I made reference to are critically important, right? And again, an investment in universities, which is an investment that's at the center of the 5-year budget proposal, I think is critical to creating those kind of dynamic clusters that will bring together this high human capital society and allow them to invest in the kind of ventures that could be economically successful in the information economy. But to connect it back to the liberal arts and to the humanities, the liberal arts connection is about ensuring the ethics of the new industry, right? Platform economy, the gig economy, the virtual economy, the remote economy, they all carry with them real dangers of dystopia, of increasing inequality, alienation, enemy. So I think it's important that these investments in the information economy be rooted in an ethics, a political culture that demands accountability and demands that we answer to the needs of sustainability and promoting equality. The humanities comes in on the creative side. I mean, I'm not the right person to comment on this, but even with my superficial knowledge of Kerala history and culture, there's no doubt to me, and you see this in the tourism industry in particular, the artistic and literary and media cultures of Kerala are extraordinarily rich. And the new information economy is, among other things, about building on those cultures, right? So I think rooting the development of the new information economy in the creative cultures of Kerala is also going to be critical to developing a comparative edge. They can do coding in China and South Korea as well. The question is, who can do the creative coding? Who can do the creative informational economy? And it has to be informed by deep cultures. And I think Kerala has that deep culture, but the critical part is institutionally linking the STEM parts of the university to the humanities and the liberal arts. I know that's still way more abstract than what you're looking for. But.
Thank you, Professor Heller. Lucid, elegant, and of course, social democratic as usual. Very good to hear you. The key to your presentation is the concept of embeddedness. The democracy must be embedded, the democratic state must be embedded within the society. And the extreme of a non-embedded state would be the colonial state. But even within the post-independent state, you can have state governments which are as much alienated, almost as much alienated as the colonial governments in many parts of India. And Kerala, as Eric Allenwright has very commented, in our 2000 seminar, in fact, that was one of the themes. Kerala state is embedded and how it came to be embedded. One, the whole structure of the government machinery, where you have much higher proportion of lower caste, poorer people, and so on, in their upward mobility, and union and employees are organized in the sense they see themselves independent of the government machinery. So structure of the government, and second, the kind of social mobilization which brings these governments into power. And that linkage is very, very strong. And now there is a new component, democratic decentralization, which has opened up tremendous democratic space at the local level. I'm now engaged in profiling, my target is 1,000 persons, how they utilize this democratic space at the local level. Now that panchayat, municipality come to be embedded in the local society. And at the cutting edge, the great walls between civil society and the state begins to merge. They begin, the difference is not obliterated, but you can't distinguish. It would be difficult to identify. Now, this provides an opportunity for Kerala to make a brave attempt to change the economic base. So far, our interventions has been mainly in the area of superstructure, redistribution, political and so on. But now basic economy has remained the same, how to change it. And that's where information technology is going to play a very important role. Trying to get a little cake, part of the cake of the new gig economy, global economy, say, transforming the technology in our traditional sectors, both agriculture and industry. And there, the comment you made about cluster is very, very important, the role of universities. In fact, that is the great weakness of Kerala. If you ask me, this whole structure, the social capital of Kerala, the abundance of state, synergy, all these are, I think, a very positive thing. But it's the university, where the Kerala University is no comparison to the, say, the school education system, which is definitely one of the best in India. Not individual one school, but the general school system. But you can't say that about anyway about the university system. And now that's a big, big challenge. That's before Kerala. If Kerala want to really go in the direction which you have commented, I think that is that holds the key. I don't know how I made certain proposals in my budget, but one key element in my thinking is linking internationally. Information technology allows you to do that. Everyone who wants to have another world, let me put that way. Another world, when anybody who believes that another world is possible, bringing them into alliance to support Kerala to make this transition, change this university system and so on, in the sense of mentoring students, identifying innovation, moving the innovation to product stage. So not only Malayalis outside, but as I told you, everyone who thinks that is very important democratic experiment that is taking place here. So I will stop here. Divya has said brief comments. So Divya, very nice to meet you, man. This is so long.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah, we will start with Meenakshi's question. Mahmood, I believe your question has been partially answered by Dr. Isaac and followed by Dr. Ofira's question.
Divya, you have to unmute.
Yes, thank you, Divya, for unmuting me. Isaac, I hope you haven't forgotten about me. I haven't seen you in a very many years, but it's wonderful to see you again, and it's wonderful to see Michael. My question let me introduce myself to all of you. I'm a historian of science. My name is Meenakshi Menon, and I'm a research scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, Germany. Now, one thing that worries me terribly about the culture that we might want to build to improve education in Kerala, that is that we can't allow the corporatization that is the model with which, for instance, my institution is run, and the institutions that I graduated from, the University of California, for instance. There seems to be no way, as far as I can tell, to resolve this tension. So how are we going to deal with the embeddedness of the state in a way so that Kerala University doesn't become, Kerala universities don't become Taylorist? I mean, I feel like I am an assembly line worker producing research articles, and I'm under tremendous pressure. I don't get Saturdays off. I don't get Sundays off. So I would hate to see that happen in Kerala. Thank you.
Can I comment? I'm not quite sure how we're doing this. Are we responding to questions or collecting questions?
We could collect few more questions and then you could respond together.
I'll follow your lead, Divya.
Sure. If you look at the chat box, Dr. Ophira and Mahmood both have somewhat related questions, but also very distinct questions. Dr. Ophira, would you like to ask your question? Mahmood, can you unmute?
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you. Yeah, my question is because you mentioned the information economy, and we are currently in a state of crisis, ongoing crisis. And Kerala experienced a crisis since 2017, basically. So my question is about what happens with misinformation and disinformation that always come into play, and how would you perceive what I see with the COVID coming from your place, from the United States, is a lot of efforts of misinforming and disinforming the public about COVID coming, from Stanford. There's a war in Stanford at the moment. So, and it affects, it affects how even globally we deal with the pandemic. So if you look at Kerala, and if you can tell me, maybe you have been observing also what was happening in the past 4 years with social media in Kerala, with the role of intellectuals in Kerala, artists and so forth, around, dealing with environmental crisis, and to a certain extent also with the COVID. A bit too long, I'm sorry.
Professor Heller, would you like to respond?
Yeah, so let me begin with the question about universities and the problem of corporatization and link it to something that Thomas Isaac said. So, I mean, universities are part of civil society, ideally, right? American universities all have some kind of Latin motto, and it's always about, the pursuit of knowledge, it's the pursuit of truth, etc. And, Foucault argued that you can never separate truth and power. Power is truth, truth is power, knowledge is power, etc. If that's true, then, we might as well all give up. I think the history of universities, I mean, going back to medieval universities, the watchword has always been autonomy, right? That a university can be good at pursuing knowledge, if not the truth, but at least good knowledge, if it is autonomous. Autonomous from what? The market, for sure. We don't want universities to be corporatized. We don't want them to be, Fordist factories for producing docile proletarians, right? We want universities to cultivate modern, cosmopolitan, multicultural, thoughtful, critical, creative, informed citizens, right? So we all agree on these ideals, but to operationalize it, the university cannot be run by the logic of the commodity logic, the logic of profits, but it must also not be an extension of the state and political logics, right? I mean, I grew up in Europe and went to some European universities, and they were incredibly bureaucratic and top down, and appointments are made through very powerful networks of professors, and they're basically in the business of reproducing universities, and they're extensions of state power. And in India, the universities, even the great universities, tend to be quite bureaucratic. And we've seen even Ashoka, which is a private university, there's been political interference, et cetera. So the watchword is autonomy. And I went to the University of California as well, and there's lots of corporatization taking place in the US. But this is the first and maybe only time I'll ever do this. There are not many US institutions that I can defend, right? I mean, certainly democracy is in crisis. The public healthcare system is a shambles, tremendous inequality, the racism, polarization, et cetera. One of the institutions in the US that still works pretty damn well is the university. And my university is private. It's a nonprofit, but many of the great American universities, including the one where I got my PhD, Berkeley, and there's Texas and Michigan, these are all public universities. And are they struggling? Yes. And still, we get at Brown every year, we get 50,000 applications for 2,000 positions, and almost half those applications are international. and people want to come to American universities because they are still, all things considered, with all the problems, etc., places where you can learn, and where socially we've got it all wrong. It's a hierarchical system, and it's largely just reproducing class inequality, for sure. Pedagogically, American universities work pretty well, and they work pretty well because they are run by the faculty. It's that simple. The governance system it's faculty run. And do you have to answer to a board? Do you have to make money? Do you have to answer to market logics? Do you have to follow state regulations? Yes, yes, yes. But this is the last quasi-Fabian institution in the world. We are self-governing. And because we're self-governing, there's a degree of autonomy that I think is still quite unique and worth celebrating. I don't think Indian universities have come anywhere near to that level of being autonomous from the state and market logics. I can't comment on Kerala University. I just don't have enough knowledge, but I would, and to Isaac's point, insofar as there is an investment in universities, it has to be a material investment, but also an institutional investment of making them autonomous and self-governing. And then on the point Isaac made, and I just want to say this because I would love for this to be a conversation going forward. I think Kerala universities, like many other universities in the world, are very parochial. They're focused on all things Kerala, which is understandable, but I do think they need to be much more cosmopolitan. And it's a two-way street, right? Bringing more international students and faculty and people to Kerala universities, but at the same time exporting more of what Kerala has to offer. Because it saddens me to say this, but globally there's very little knowledge about Kerala. There's already very little knowledge about, the knowledge production is very north-south, et cetera, and we need to decenter and deprovincialize knowledge. And the best way to do that is to build networks. And hopefully they won't just be Zoom networks, they'll be actual real in-person encounters. And then on the second question about misinformation, again, especially now that everyone has access to the public sphere, it means all the crazies have access to the public sphere. It means anyone can become a knowledgeable interlocutor in social media, including, Stanford so-called scientists who peddle false theories about COVID. That said, even in the US, there's a lot of tremendous pushback. Right. So I'm in the state of Rhode Island, and in the state of Rhode Island, everyone is vaccinated, everyone wore masks, everyone followed the protocols, everyone listened to the public health officials. None of them talked any nonsense. It was all straightforward science. Here's the science, here's what we know. And Kerala's been very similar. I mean, Kerala's had its problems, and obviously it's still dealing with the pandemic, but from a pure information point of view, people are getting vaccinated. And public officials, ministers, agencies have not been spewing misinformation. There's been really good communication. And so it is political. Democrats and the LDF do a better job of talking about COVID than right-wingers and the BJP.
We do have a comment that actually raises some pertinent concerns about universities and the structure of universities. Mr. C.K. Ramachandran, it's not just enough to talk about the quality of universities, but also the political class that governs universities. We know in Kerala, just like in many universities in India, it's difficult to bypass political conventions, or the question of what is being taught as part of the curriculum. So that was a concern raised by one of the audience members. It actually ties up to what Mahmood is waiting to ask about the nature of universities.
Yeah, thank you, Divya. And also thank you, Professor Heller and Dr. Thomas Isaac, for wonderful discussion related to the status of universities as well as the embedded democracy in the state. So my question is sort of related to that. One of the major emphasis in your talk was on the the embedded democracy within Kerala, and also towards the end you mentioned about the major demand for the universities for them to be autonomous, right? So the autonomy and embedded democracy in a way, in the case of Kerala university system, higher education system, are mutually exclusive, in the sense that the universities are too embedded in the contemporary, in the local politics, and therefore they lose their autonomy, right? So, and I wonder, like, how you might, like, we cannot, of course, isolate the universities from the local embedded democracy that you were talking about. But at the same time, we cannot also overlook the long trajectory of the universities in the European model of the old like really modern bourgeois, sort of like aristocratic universities, and then the American model, especially by the mid 20th century, that became that sort of like democratized the universities. But in between, there is this like a unique Kerala model of universities as well, where it is too embedded, and because of their embeddedness, they lose their autonomy, and therefore it reversely or in it affects the disciplines such as like humanities and social science. And I wonder like how do you reflect on these issues, and also as Professor Dr. Thomas Isaac asked, like what could be the way forward?
No, that is the 100,000 crore question. And it is literally the title of Peter Evans's 1995 book called Embedded Autonomy. And I want to use that example to reflect on the point you just made. And by the way, I agree entirely with, I don't know Kerala universities that well, but from the chat column and from the little I do know, that the problem you identify is clearly a problem. So in embedded autonomy, Evans said, okay, what did the South Korean state do? It didn't have a bourgeoisie, it didn't have any industry, right? But it had a few entrepreneurs. So it worked with them closely. And it basically communicated with the entrepreneurs and said, what do you need? And the key was to support them so they could thrive as entrepreneurs, develop their businesses, become export focused, and succeed in export markets. That's the embeddedness part, working them. What do you need? You need transport services, you need a subsidy, you need zero interest loans, you need some inputs that we can help you with, maybe we'll help you negotiate export markets, et cetera. Okay. But they have to be entrepreneurs. They have to be creative. They have to, think for themselves and innovate, et cetera. So you don't want them to become dependent on the state. But by the same token, you don't want them as industrials to become so powerful that they capture the state. So the state has to be embedded, it has to work with them, but it has to be, quote, autonomous. And how do you build autonomy? Professionalism. And this is our theory of all professions. We should tell teachers, your goal is to teach, and it's to teach everyone, and to teach Blacks and whites, men and women across classes. It's an inclusive democratic mission of teaching. But we shouldn't tell teachers how to teach. The profession should teach them how to teach, to be good teachers, to be innovative, to be creative, etc. It's the same with the medical profession. We don't want to micromanage doctors and nurses. We want them to answer to the democratic ethos of treating all patients equally, and respecting the Hippocratic Oath and respecting privacy laws, et cetera, but we allow the medical profession and the nurses profession to develop their own professional standards and qualities, et cetera. So you want to preserve the autonomy, but you also want to define the larger objectives, right? And that's the embeddedness part. So in the United States, there's tons of autonomy for the university, which is terrific, but there's very little democratic control over the university, in that we haven't been able to structure the university system in such a way that it actually promotes equality. So I would favor more intervention in the US to repurpose American universities so that they answer the larger democratic goal of promoting education with equality and diversity. On the other hand, I don't want Trumpists telling me that I can't teach critical race theory in my sociology courses, right? And so that's the balance. And we all live this professionally every day. This is a continuous conflict, right? I don't want anyone, whether it's Black Lives Movement or the Trumpists, telling me what's in my syllabus. But I do want them to hold me and my institution to account if we don't contribute to the broader mission of knowledge production, inclusion, creativity, diversity, and promoting equality. I mean, that's a very abstract answer, but.
We have time for 2 questions. The first one from Mr. Umar, followed by Dr. Varghese. Umar, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hello, Professor Heller. Would you say that immersivity, which is a catchphrase in data science, of which you talked a bit, can be correlated with embeddedness? Because embeddedness comes from a context of non-alienation. So immersivity has become the catchphrase for data science in terms that virtual reality plays around with immersivity. So can a correlation be found between the immersivity of data science and the non-alienated embeddedness that you are speaking of? Has this become a kind of ideology, especially in terms of the environment, where alienation has become sort of problematized?
Yeah, I'm afraid I like the term immersive. I could barely say it, but not really being familiar with the concept in the data sciences. I'm reluctant to draw parallels or draw differences because it's too new for me. So I'm sorry, but I have to. Someone else in this forum is probably much more qualified to speak to this than I am.
We have a question on migration, but also on the question of viable alternatives, because we can't really make a case for Kerala exceptionalism all the time. And given the fact that there is a national education policy, there are other central policies, Vinny Krishna raises the question, how do we, stop the devaluation of the humanities and social sciences? Is there a way that, we can not talk so much about marketability, but still find a viable alternative? And followed by Dr. Varghese's question on migration, given the fact that there is a significant number of migrants or what is called educational migration from Kerala, and how does that impact the project of reinventing universities' knowledge economy? And to that, if I may add, one of the reasons why we started iSure is because the majority of the members of iSure's initial committee are not in Kerala. Having experienced the best school education like Dr. Isaac raised, but somehow felt the need for more globalized training or more up-to-date training elsewhere in the world. And that is one of the reasons we are having this set of programs to talk about how do we come back or give back to society. So 2 questions, one on alternatives and 2 on educational migration.
Yeah, I want to give Thomas Isaac a chance to respond as well. But just very quickly on the humanities and social sciences question, I think this goes back fundamentally to the quote I read from Gurpreet Mahajan. If we care about democracy, we care about diversity. If we care about diversity, we have to have deep knowledge of our own histories. We have to be self-reflective about our own identities. We have to learn to value the multiplicity of identities that constitutes a modern democratic society. And that's, of course, the fundamental mission of the humanities. I mean, ultimately, identity and recognition are the very heart of human subjectivity, right? And so being deeply invested in a knowledge of ourselves, our cultures, and all their diversity and our histories is just fundamental to modern human cosmopolitan identity. The social sciences are crucial because and here I'll just give one example. If you ask Americans, what is the level of inequality in the United States? They vastly underestimate it, vastly, not even close. And if you ask them what should be the level of inequality that's allowable in a society, they pretty much answer very, very little and way less than what we actually have. So there's obviously an information problem here, right? The social sciences, even though we've documented time and time again, racial, gender, class, income, wealth, spatial inequalities, we haven't done a very good job of getting that into the public sphere, right? And without a knowledge of inequality, without a knowledge of all the sources of cleavage and fragmentation in society, it's very difficult to self-govern as a democratic society, right? So for the very survival and the essence and the possibilities of democracy, we have to invest in the social sciences and the humanities. As for tapping into, you know, migrant networks, et cetera, you guys are doing it. So you should talk about it and I should learn from you. But I'm sure Thomas Isaac has a lot to say about this as well.
Dr. Isaac, are you still logged on? Because there might be some connectivity issues. So I think we've lost Dr. Isaac's connection. Would you like to respond to the question of migration in detail, or we could just conclude the session if Dr. Isaac is not able to join? Okay. So thank you.
Divya,
Yeah.
Isaac sir ഇല്ലേ അതിന്?
No, he is not here.
Okay. Then okay. Let us conclude. Okay.
So thank you everyone for participating in this session. I know there might be further queries and comments. Feel free to write in to us. We shall also be soon announcing our next webinar for the next month. Similarly, on a topic that is close to the question of Kerala society and economy. We will also be advertising it on various platforms. So if you'd like to reach out officially, you are feel free to do so. But for now, on behalf of iSure and everyone else present here, let me thank Professor Heller for this very provocative talk. I know a lot of us may not agree with everything that you have said, but clearly it does give us an entry point to having larger conversations. Thank you for taking your time out. And thank you everyone for staying with us despite it being dinner time here in India. Mahmood?
That's it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Heller.
Yeah, and thanks to all of you for organizing this, for this incredible initiative. And I just want to say, you know, please do be in touch. It's nice to have a Zoom event, but it would be nice if we carry this forward and actually network. And as hopefully we get past the pandemic, that we could start doing this in person, whether you come to Brown or I have the opportunity, which I hope to have, to come to Kerala again. So I really hope this is just the beginning of building some new and very exciting networks. So thank you very much.
Thank you.